My name is Jessica Petersen. I'm an invertebrate ecologist with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. And I want to tell you a little bit about a project we completed recently, the Minnesota Wild Bee Survey, and some lessons learned. This project was funded by the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund, which is our lottery dollars in Minnesota. The goals of this project were really threefold. To first database Minnesota bee specimens that were in collections already. Primarily those specimens were not databased, were not in existing platforms like GBIF or SCAN. And so we went around to those museums and databased those specimens to get an initial list of species. We then surveyed bees from 2015 to 2022. Prior to these surveys, Frederick Washburn published the only list in 1918 describing 66 species that reside in Minnesota and described that as woefully inadequate. So clearly there's a need for a baseline list of species of bees in Minnesota. And then lastly, we wanted to make sure that we created products from these results. We have already published a collaborative state checklist with the Caribou Native Bee Lab at the University of Minnesota. And we plan to use the data collected throughout this project to inform the state threatened and endangered list and the species of greatest conservation need list for the upcoming revision of the Minnesota Wildlife Action Plan. So we'll start with this first goal of visiting museums. We visited or loaned material from 8 different collections, and that resulted in 21,500 specimens. And a whopping 427 species were documented. So really there was a lot of material already in collections that was very easily, relatively so, databased and understood a wide variety of the diversity of bees in Minnesota already, certainly more than the 66 species previously known. So if you're looking to start a project like this, starting with the museums is a really great place. We then went on to sample or survey bees from 2015 to 2022 at a variety of both public and private sites throughout Minnesota. Primarily, these were wildlife management areas, scientific natural areas, nature conservancy preserves, state parks, mostly public land in all 87 counties. We sampled bees about 4,500 different times. Many of the specimens came from bull trapping events that were more standardized sampling events from about May to September, depending on when there was snow. And these elevated bull traps of the 3 different colors were set out every 3 weeks or so for a total of 24 hours each sampling event. We also conducted quite a lot of meandering hand net events. These were more opportunistic and not necessarily very structured, coming upon a site that has a lot of floral diversity, jumping out of the car, sampling some bees, and moving on. So certainly much less structured than the bull trapping events. But as I mentioned, most of our 53,000 specimens came from bull trapping. That's because bull trapping tends to collect a lot of bees. It's about 74% of our specimens come from bull traps. About 22% come from hand netting, and these numbers have continued to diverge as we've moved on in this project, which I'll describe a little bit more in the next couple slides. We also took in some specimens from what other people would have considered their bycatch, mostly in agricultural areas where people were sampling for pests. We took their bees and identified those and incorporated those into our database. Our identification process includes, obviously collecting and processing specimens, labeling, getting all specimens to have our preliminary ID, databasing them, and then all specimens were sent to Dr. Zach Portman at the University of Minnesota to be confirmed, for those identifications to be confirmed. Thus far, we have confirmed 82% of the specimens, their IDs have been confirmed, and 91% of those unidentified specimens are from bulls. Primarily Lasioglossum, which are difficult to identify. So again, this is one of the few reasons that we moved away from bull trapping through time, was that we really didn't want these specimens that we knew we couldn't ID. because we really value being able to identify specimens and processing them and putting them accessioning them into a university. So after our specimens are identified, they're accessioned into the University of Minnesota Insect Collection in St. Paul. So what have we learned? Well, thus far, we have documented 360 species through these surveys since 2015. And we think, this is a pretty great number, although it's not the total 427 that we found in collections, and it's certainly not the 508 that we found through our collaborative work with the Bee Lab and the state checklist. But that's because our goal wasn't necessarily an inventory, but we found a lot of really great species. So not only did we not find all those 427, we also added quite a few to the state list. So we added 23 species to the state list, new state records. These included some things like Antheniellum boreale, which is a new genus to Minnesota, and Osmia nearctica, which is a new species to the US, previously only known from Canada. So some exciting new state records. We also have expanded county records. So this Andrena rudbeckiae, we now know comes from many more counties. Previously, we only knew it from these 2 green counties, from museum records. Now we have a greater sense of its entire distribution, which can inform conservation. We also learned to utilize these historical collections in a different way. We looked at who we were missing, what species we were missing, whether or not they were specialists on certain plants, and that helped to inform some targeted plant sampling. So for example, the pickerel weed specialist Duphoria noviangeli was last seen in 1934 in just a single location at a single time in a single county. We have since obviously greatly expanded that to 25 specimens from 6 sites in 2022 and many more in the Twin Cities metro in 2023 that's not represented on this map. So we found it almost everywhere we have looked. And this is one example of many where we looked to the historical collections and found species that we hadn't found yet and went to their host plants and found them pretty easily. We also began to learn that hand netting was far more profitable towards our survey goal than bull trapping. So hand netting resulted in an approximate 402 species with continued collection at this rate. Bee bulls, however, topped off at about 345 species. And we collected very many more unique species by hand netting than bull trapping. So 100 species we collected by hand nets that weren't collected in bull traps versus only 41 species in bull traps that weren't collected in hand netting. And many of those that were hand net were species that are allegolectic on certain plant taxa, which we are thinking are most likely those species that are of conservation concern. And so to inform things like the state checklist or the state threatened and endangered list, it's important to understand these specialist bees, and hand netting is the way to go. We also could have done a better job focusing on previously undersurveyed provinces. So prior to our work, sampling effort was not equally distributed across the state. In Minnesota, the boreal forests in the Northeast housed about 208 species known from collections and from 4,000 specimens, whereas the prairie had, in the western part of the state, in the yellow there, had far more specimens and a few more species. Our work added many more species to these undersurveyed ecoregions. So in that boreal forest in the Northeast, in the purple there, we added 100 species from only 9,000 specimens, versus in the prairie, 24 species from 18,000 specimens. So much more larger bang for your buck. This is confounded by the emphasis on bull trapping versus hand netting, because we did more hand netting in the boreal forest compared to the prairie. So it's a little bit of an apples to oranges comparison. But still, I think focusing on undersurveyed ecoregions would do a lot towards a statewide bee survey. We also found, kind of oddly, we don't really know why, that bull traps didn't catch many bees in the forest. So here shows the average number of specimens per bull trap event. being far fewer in that Laurentian mixed forest or the boreal forest in the Northeast compared to the prairie. So it's unclear. This is another reason we kind of abandoned bull traps in the forest. And another plug for taxonomists and their involvement in this work. We couldn't have done this without Zach Portman, and having highly trained parataxonomists is also very important, but knowing what they know is also good for the taxonomists to not have to redo a lot of their work. So involving a taxonomist early on in the start of a project is super important. So we have collaborated with the University of Minnesota to publish a list of 508 species. This was published in Zootaxa this year, and we're now using these data to inform the state T&E list updates. So here's some thank yous, and hope you enjoyed it. Thanks.